It's beautiful, isn't it? In a famous couplet, the poet Joyce Kilmer once wrote, "I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree." And all of us can't help but smile at that thought. But this beautiful thing, this magnificent 10,000-pound organism, was never really meant to stand in isolation like this. It is the nature of trees, or at least most of them, to live in crowded communities of their fellows. If they were animals, we would refer to them as herd animals, highly social creatures that live in rich, crowded communities. Nearly all the trees in the world live in places like this. They live in forests. With a view like this, it's easy to see that the forest consists of 5 layers: the soil, the forest floor, the shrub layer, the understory, and the canopy. At the bottom is the soil layer. And here, in this loam, there are teeming numbers of organisms that are involved in the process of decomposing the enormous amount of biomass that rains down from the treetops. In fact, in some ways, soil is the most biologically productive ecosystem on the planet. The vast majority of organisms in the soil are microbes, and their numbers are astonishing. In rich soil like this, it appears that there may be as many as 1 million cells per gram of soil. 1 million microscopic organisms in a little pinch of dirt like this. And that means that in a handful of soil, there are more microorganisms than there are human beings on the earth. In these modern times, we all know how important it is to celebrate biodiversity, to rejoice in the amazing variety of life on Earth. Well, here it is, right in this hidden forest, in this wonderful world that exists right beneath our feet, every time we walk among the trees. When a tree falls over, like this one did, it gives us a great opportunity to examine its roots. It is easy to see where some of the taproots extended down into the soil to give the tree access to deep sources of moisture during times of drought. But most people are surprised to learn that the majority of a tree's roots actually extend laterally off to all sides and only at a depth of about 1 to 2 feet into the soil. This is what gives each tree its lateral stability, which is a critical adaptation. After all, a tree is comprised of enormous weight that is teetering on only a single stalk. And when a strong wind pushes on the leaves and branches at the top, the leverage down at the bottom is enormous. It is critical then for any tree to spread out a strong and wide lateral base in order to resist the forces that conspire to topple over. Here at the base of the trunk, we can see each tree preparing to face such forces. Where the tree begins to intersect with the ground, it spreads out long lateral processes called prop roots, like these ones here. They provide powerful braces along the forest lines that come to bear down here when the wind blows up there. And down here in the tropics, we see that same adaptation played out on a particularly large scale. For one thing, the trees down here grow to truly dizzying heights. And for another thing, the tropics experience among the strongest winds on the planet. Winds of hurricanes and monsoons. Consequently, the prop roots of many tree species, like this fig, have evolved to be particularly elaborate and strong. In these cases, biologists refer to them as buttresses, borrowing an architectural term that refers to the side braces deliberately built onto a tall wall, like in a medieval church. The form and shape of these buttresses are themselves a delight. They invariably invoke a childlike impulse to explore the mazes the miniature alleyways create. And I'm going to do just that. When an individual tree reaches the end of its life and topples over, like this one recently did, the event creates a considerable change in the immediate vicinity, and it triggers a significant chain of events that transpire in its wake. In this way, cellulose and other organic molecules of the wood are digested and transformed into the organic molecules that make up all of these organisms, that make up this entire web of life. Biologists prefer to fall in logs on the ground, like this one, as nurse logs, and they serve as linear nursery zones for baby trees. In some forests, this process is so common that it is possible to see multiple trees lined up in a row, having all started out on the same fallen log. Eventually, the initial rich source of nutrients is completely digested by the microorganisms of decay, but the signs of its presence at the beginning of this tree's life are still quite evident at the space where this tree reaches the ground. The shape of the original nurse log is still quite visible when you take the time to look for it. Here on the forest floor, we find most of the mammals that inhabit a forest, or at least the larger ones. We often don't see many of them because they are so shy of humans, but they are here. And one way to confirm that is through the use of devices like this one. Often, biologists set devices like these at randomly selected locations in an effort to get the most objective distribution of animals in an area. Rising just above the forest floor is what ecologists refer to as the shrub layer, where the relatively short plants make their living, down here, underneath these towering trees. In deciduous forests, like this one, there are entire periods each year when there are no leaves overhead. Since deciduous leaves don't grow back until later in the spring, it affords plants in the shrub layer, like these, a couple of months of direct sunlight. Most of these shrubs are specialists in springtime growth spurts. It is the time of the year when they grow the most, flower, and reproduce. Viewing this time-lapse video is a good way to appreciate that. Notice how the shrub layer fills in almost completely before there is any sign of leaves forming overhead. It is here on the forest floor and in this tangled shrub layer that we humans experience the forest. We are such heavy creatures that we are almost always stuck down here on the ground. But that is a shame. A forest is truly a three-dimensional thing. There is a lot more up there. And to appreciate that, we have to climb. Up here, only a body length or two above the ground, the forest already begins to feel like a different place. This layer of the forest is called the understory by ecologists. And what it feels like is a big open space, enclosed at the top by the forest canopy and on the bottom by the shrubs and forest floor. The sensation of openness is so striking up here compared to just below. It's no wonder that so many bird species use this layer of the forest for rapid flights from place to place. And with this climbing rig and a little bit of imagination, perhaps I can even get a feel for what it's like to be a bird. Once you finally reach the canopy, it is a transformative experience. The perspective is so different up here from what you get from simply looking up from the ground. There is a maze of horizontal branches crisscrossing in a web that makes up an intricate system of highways and byways that are used by the phenomenal diversity of life that exists up here. In a forest, this is where the real action is. This is where the trees are taking in most of the sunlight they'll use to carry out photosynthesis, and it's where they do most of their active growing. As a consequence, there is a lot of food up here, lots and lots of food. It is present in the form of the active leaf buds and growing shoots, but also in the pollen and nectar, seeds, nuts, and fruit that all of these different species of trees produce. It is a smorgasbord, and all sorts of different species have adapted to take advantage of it. In fact, ecologists tell us that there is more biodiversity in the canopy of the forest than in any other layer. Perhaps the soil ecologists would dispute that, but regardless, the incredible diversity up here at least rivals that which is seen down there on the ground. Up here, nearly 50 feet above the ground, one immediately appreciates the elasticity of trees. If we think about it, this is something that most people already know at some level. After all, we all know that branches bend much more often than they break. It is in the nature of trees that they are bendable. But up here, you really appreciate just how much this is an essential characteristic of trees. I'm up here on just an ordinary day, and even on a day like this, the tree trunk here is moving back and forth, flexing and bending with each gust of wind. To understand this, we have to recognize that each tree leaf acts just like a miniature sail that catches the wind. Now, of course, the force on any one leaf is not all that great, but consider the fact that each tree has tens of thousands of leaves, and that all of those forces are combined. Holding on up here, it's obvious that the combination of those forces is enough to move a tree trunk like this one. The wind starts to blow really hard, and the trees do much more than sway. I'm up here in this same tree, but this time I can tell you it's doing much more than just gently swaying. The experience now is more like a shaking and jolting. So how often does this happen? Well, in most places, it's about once a week or so that a weather front passes through with its accompanying gusty winds. So in other words, weather like this is a commonplace occurrence in the lives of these trees. Plants, unlike animals, cannot move around to collect the resources they need. You can think of plants as following a stand-and-fight lifestyle. Any given new plant has to make do with the place where its seed originally fell. This one here appears to have had the good luck of landing in fertile soil, but it might just as well have landed farther up the slope there, where conditions are far too dry, or further down the slope in that direction, where conditions are far too wet. When predators come, and by that I mean animals that are predators from the plant's point of view, we call them herbivores. There is no running away. There is no hiding. The herbivores have to be resisted. Is the use of toxins, and it could be said that this is most true of all for the coniferous trees. Trees like these are particularly distasteful. The sap that runs under their bark and up through their branches contains a whole host of nasty chemicals that makes them simply inedible. Even dating back to the time of dinosaurs and right up to the present day, species like these have continued to thrive. The two sides, trees and tree eaters, are usually in balance, but not all of the time. The struggle is always ongoing, and the course of evolution ever continues. The insects come at the trees as hard as they can, and the trees fight back with their toxins to kill the insects as best as they can. But every so often, a new type of insect comes along, and sometimes they have a new adaptation that makes them just a little more tolerant of the tree's toxins, a little more able to overcome the tree's defenses. And when that happens, the balance tips temporarily to the insects. This is what appears to be happening right now over wide areas in the western portions of North America. For reasons still being studied, there are now huge populations of pine bark beetles that are wreaking havoc in standing communities of lodgepole pines. That brown tree over there has been killed by an infestation of pine bark beetles, and so have these trees here that have already fallen. And the effect in some forests can be devastating. Here in Colorado, I can see that 1 out of 10 trees has already been infected by these insects. The trees of this forest have been decimated. That's the literal meaning of that term, the killing of 1 out of every 10. There's something else about being in a forest. It's simply lovely, isn't it? It's simply impossible not to enjoy what you're seeing. The myriad forms made up by the vegetation can take your breath away. When I'm walking through a forest, I feel like I'm walking through one of nature's art galleries. The vegetation here possesses subtle shading, delicate curves, repetitive themes, symmetry, and so many other aesthetic elements that I can hardly list them. It's simply impossible not to appreciate its beauty. Like a beautiful piece of music, it raises your spirits and fills your soul. One can rejoice in the fact that there are as many different types and subtypes of forests as there are locations on the earth. In each place that a forest grows, the specific circumstances of that area, its particular climate, soil type, etc., result in an ecosystem that is uniquely suited to that location. That is one of the things I love most about forests. Their ecosystems are almost infinitely variable, reflecting an uncountable number of unique adaptations. One could spend a lifetime studying biology out here and still be thrilled with new discoveries every day. Besides ecotype distinctions, there is another important point to consider. Here in Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, I'm walking through what's called a secondary forest. That means it's an area where the original forest was once completely cut down as part of a logging operation. The human demand for wood has been so great that nearly every forest in most places, or at least nearly every forest in North America, is a secondary forest, one that grew up after the initial great logging boom that occurred a century ago. All of this is what has grown up in its place since the logging was stopped and the area was placed under protection. It is still wonderful, a marvelous forest in every way. But the fact that it is a secondary forest means that, as forests go, it's relatively young. This tree here is 50 years old. That's how long ago all the trees in the area were last cleared away. But there are still places where the logger's axe never fell and a huge saw is never cut. These stands of trees give us glimpses of primary forests. They exist very much as they were even before Columbus and the other Europeans arrived on the continent. This great white pine is 250 years old and stands at a towering height of over 150 feet tall. In other places, the enormity of the scale, the height and volume of the trees, the amount of sheer biomass represented is almost beyond imagining. When you're here among these forest giants, it really does take your breath away. This particular area is referred to as Cathedral Grove, and that evokes a metaphor that is truly apt. It really does give you the sense of being inside a cathedral with its massive vertical rises and towering ceiling. Even more than that, it gives one the same sense of awe and greatness that one experiences in a church. Being here, you can't help but feel that there is much more than yourself, that there is a beauty and greatness far beyond that of one person. These are the Douglas firs of British Columbia, cousins of the redwoods and sequoias found along the Pacific Northwest coast in North America. Biologists cannot tell us why these giants came to thrive in only this particular corner of the earth, but I am so glad that they did. That tree there took root during the lifetime of George Washington. It now thrives at an age of 250 years old. And just look, in this forest, it can only be considered medium size. At 2.5 centuries old, it is a relative youngster. This tree is 800 years old. 800 years! It was a new seedling at the time of the Magna Carta and was already going on 100 years of age when William Wallace led his revolution in Scotland. From the point of view of these great giants, our human lifespans are but a blink. This great tree, this wonderful forest, may have been visited by my great-grandmother, and it will be standing here still to be touched by my own great-grandchildren. And that alone is perhaps the most important thing to consider about a forest. The deep span of time that these organisms, that these ecosystems experience. And if we want to experience more of the forest than we do in the usual way, then we definitely also have to experience it at night. After all, about half of any 24-hour period is the nighttime, and hence half of any forest's life is spent in darkness. We hardly ever think of them this way, but the trees are still here after the sun goes down. There are the same swaying branches, the same rustling leaves, but when you look, and for us that usually means having to use an artificial light, then you can immediately see that the inhabitants are different. Of course, inhabitants is not really the right word. These animals inhabit a forest 24 hours a day. It is just that they hide and scarcely move when the light is out. So, just like in a human city, it is a matter of a day shift of workers being replaced by the night shift. I can see a few moths and bats flying in and out of my beam of artificial light, but that is, in its way, just what it sounds like. Artificial. If we really want to experience the forest in the most natural way possible, or at least in a way that may more closely resemble what these creatures experience, then we will do well to turn off our artificial lights. There's also the sense of smell. The smell of the forest during the night and day seems similar at first, but when you tune everything else out and focus in on it, you can begin to pick up differences. They are subtle at first, almost subconscious, but when you really concentrate on it, you find that the nighttime does indeed bring with it new smells. These come both from flowers that bloom only at night, trying as they do to attract nocturnal pollinators, as well as from animals that are only active in the nighttime. Most of those animals are only communicating with each other by a class of chemicals called pheromones. It is a rich smorgasbord of smells. It is wave after wave of varying aromas that, in their own way, are just as wonderful to experience as the beautiful sights during the daytime. And when you stop and pay attention, you realize that they are even louder and reflect an even greater diversity than those of the daytime. This is not surprising when you think about it. All nocturnal animals, insects included, have to rely more on sound for their signaling, since vision is of so little use under these circumstances. If you have not yet done so, then you should definitely give this a try. Arrange somehow to spend some time alone in a forest at night. Leave off your lights, remain perfectly still, and listen. You will hear the moaning of the swaying branches and the whispering of the rustling leaves. And all of that will be background to the music made by the countless insects and other animals. The sounds of the forest will envelop you, and the earth will be singing to you. At this time when our planet is undergoing climate change, we are drawn to think of the many beneficial roles that forests play on a global scale. For one thing, they moderate our weather patterns. Climatologists sometimes refer to Earth as a Goldilocks planet. Not too hot, not too cold, not too wet, and not too dry. A planet ideal for human habitation. One very big reason for this is the great forests of the world. Through rain, they take moisture out of the atmosphere when it is overly wet, and through evaporation, they put moisture back into the atmosphere when it is dry. On a longer time scale, there is also the important role of forests play in moderating the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. The equation is simple. The more carbon dioxide we release into the atmosphere, the hotter it's going to get. We are all seeing the consequences of this as the glaciers and polar ice caps melt, as the deserts expand, and as weather patterns shift all over the globe. It would be so much better if we could draw some of that excess carbon back out of the atmosphere. And that is where forests come in. Scientists like to use the term biomass to address this issue. It is a way of referring to the total weight of living things in any given area. And no living things have more biomass than trees. It is hard to wrap our heads around the enormous weight of any one of these trees. And it is even harder to contemplate the amount of living material, the amount of biomass, the amount of carbon in an entire forest. When a forest is cut down and the wood is burned or allowed to decay, the huge quantity of carbon that made up that living material is released, primarily as carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. Conversely, when trees are allowed to grow, they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as they go about the process of assembling new rings and chains of carbon atoms that make up their growing structures, their active physiology. When growing trees take carbon out of the atmosphere in this way, climatologists say that carbon has been sequestered. This means that it is stored in the biomass of the forest, rather than flowing freely as a greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Have you heard the expression, plant a tree, save the earth? It is a good idea, but a better one is, protect a forest. It is not one or two trees that will bring our atmospheric carbon back into line, but rather miles and miles of forest, hundreds of miles of forest. Most significantly of all, forests are the places where the direct sunlight entering our atmosphere has its greatest impact on our biosphere. It is especially easy to think about this from up here, looking down on a vast expanse of forest. Just imagine the megawatts of power streaming down in the form of solar radiation, getting converted via 1 trillion chloroplasts inside billions of leaves into the sugars and other organic molecules upon which all other life on Earth depends. O2, that highly reactive gas that is so precious to our own lungs. The molecular oxygen that goes on to play such a critical role in so many cellular processes in nearly every organism on the planet. The oxygen that enabled us to come into existence. The oxygen that sustains us with every breath that we take. It is entirely fitting that we bring our conversation to a close at this place, where an enormous tree has fallen. To me, this single scene sums up many of the themes about forests that have so captivated me. In this one view, we get a good sense of the phenomenal spatial scale of a forest, and we are reminded of the deep dimension of time over which this living system operates. As we take it in, we are also again struck at the amazing complexity of this web of life. The biodiversity is evident both when we focus in on any little place and when we widen our focus to get a larger view of this marvelous tangle of vegetation. The biologist in me knows that it would take a lifetime to fully understand the ecology of just one small patch of this forest. And if I did devote a lifetime to the study of forest ecology, it would be a very satisfying life indeed. And the rest of me knows that if it would mean spending a lifetime in places like this, it would be a life very well spent. I hope that you too come to know and to love forests in the same way. The great naturalist John Muir once said that going to a forest is like going home, and I hope that you too come to share in that same feeling. Let this place, and let every place like it, capture your imagination and fill your spirit.